Thank you all for joining Luxury Institute's webinar on wealthy families and individuals in a time of turbulence and transition. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared after the session. The recording will also be available on Luxury Institute's website and YouTube channel. Please feel free to share your questions using the Q&A box located on your screen. We will address all questions during the last 15 minutes of the session. If you would like to connect privately to ask questions or share your feedback, please contact us. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Luxury Institute CEO, Milton Pedraza.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I have three very special guests to discuss the topic of wealthy families and individuals in a time of turbulence and transition. I want to introduce my three guests. First, Melina Spadone, Prostano, and Alexandre Monnier. And I'm going to ask each one of you please to share a little bit about your wealth advisory career journey, starting with Melina and Steve and Alex. Melina, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good morning. Thanks, Milton, for having me. I am a private wealth attorney. I work at a firm called Pillsbury, Winthrop. I've spent about almost 15 years in wealthy families in-house and then transitioned over to a law firm to have a broader platform for my clients to have services in every area of the law and across the globe.
Steve?
Good afternoon, everyone. I started my career about 35 years ago in public accounting with focus on tax and financial planning. And as I moved from public accounting to financial services, that financial orientation continued. But as I moved into the 2000s, I also recognized that the needs of families changed significantly, and they began to recognize the need for the non-financial services as being as important, if not more important. So as I built a number of multifamily offices during the 2000s into the current days, the platform expanded very definitely to include those types of non-financial advisory services. Today I head up family advisory services at PKF O'Connor Davies, which is focused on delivering strategic family enterprise planning to families and integrating all of these non-financial services to help families better sustain their wealth for multiple generations. And lastly, I recently founded the Ultra Net Worth Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank focused on the curation of content and the generation of original content and educational programming for ultra net worth individuals and families.
Thank you, Steve. Alex?
Well, thank you for having me. I've been in this industry of serving ultra high net worth individuals for about 20 years. Initially in the private jet business, where Milton and I actually met, working for Bombardier FlexJet, and then working for a health advisory company called Pinnacle Care. And most recently, I was the president of Family Office Exchange, working with about 400 families with significant family offices, helping them identify and achieve the purpose of their wealth is one way to describe it. And then last year, I joined Hawthorn, the multifamily office of PNC, to launch what we call the Hawthorn Institute for Family Success. And in short, the goal of this institute is to help families not only prepare wealth for their family, but also prepare their family for the wealth. And it's that second part, focusing not so much on financial well-being, but family well-being, for which we're building capabilities, because we strongly believe that that's where the industry is going. That's increasingly what families value and are willing to pay for, and will be the basis of competition for years to come.
Thank you. And Alex, what's the average net worth of your clients today?
So 25 million in investable assets is where it starts, and it goes into the billions of dollars. The average is a bit misleading because it's skewed by the billion-dollar families, but that gives you a range. And about half of them are first generation wealth creators, and the other half are multi-generational wealth families.
Thank you. And Steve, what's the dynamic of your client base?
Yeah, our clients typically have 100 million or more in net worth, although similar to Alex, we have a number of billion-dollar families, so that would definitely skew the average. It's a combination of families with operating businesses, family offices, all are multi-generational, usually 3 and 4 generations.
Thank you. And Melina, I know you've worked with some of the most prominent families in the world that you can't name, but what is the average net worth of your clients?
So because I was in-house, most of my clients were $1 billion plus, and that's because of the level of complexity of the business would allow for a full-time general counsel. At a law firm, we have the luxury to have clients of all sizes since we charge by the hour, but the expertise comes from a level of complexity for clients that have multi-generational families with all kinds of legal issues all over the world. And similar to what Alex and Steve were saying, we've had clients that are still in operating businesses. And so the way that you service them is slightly different than the families that are multi-generational and just preserving and growing the wealth for their future generations.
Okay, so let's start from macro to micro. Name 2 or 3 behaviors, mindsets that you've seen the wealthy evolve into during this pandemic. Alex, give me a couple of trends.
So the first one I would say is that there's a desire to want to have more impact with their wealth in their lifetime. Going away from the traditional wealth preservation model where a family would create wealth and then the first generation would create wealth and the other family members would try to preserve it. This desire to put the wealth to work to have an impact. And the second one I would say is a greater appreciation for the role that families plays in their lives, and therefore wanting to work on preserving what they have and maybe even making it stronger so they continue to have that source of resilience in the family that they can rely on the way they all have in this pandemic that we are going through.
Okay, we'll elaborate a little bit more on that. And Steve, what are your key trends? What are you seeing?
Families, as they were in the crisis and triage mode, I think found a number of areas that they had failed to really focus on in terms of their planning. So I think many families right now are looking to the future, put in place longer term plans, but governance seems to be a priority for many, many families right now because they had not spent the time that they needed to previously. Secondly, families with operating businesses obviously, faced many operational challenges during the crisis. They also potentially had inadequate business continuity plans. So many of them are really revisiting everything about their business so that they can re-enter this new world with an effective business model and the ability to make effective decisions.
Thank you. And Melina?
I would say from our perspective, we see clients using this forced pause to do a lot of housekeeping. And that housekeeping can range, as Steve said, to doing business continuity plans or reviewing their trust and estates, all the way to full-blown audits of their family offices. We're doing one right now with Deloitte & Touche to sort of say, well, we can't operate business as usual. Let's see what we've done and what we can do better. So as soon as the pause is over, we can hit the ground running. We've had a lot of people, to Alexandre's point, looking at the family dynamics and not so much making their wealth work in their lifetime, although that is a theme, but sort of figuring out time that they're with their family that they weren't expecting to be with their adult children to sort of talk about wealth issues, succession issues within the family, legacy issues, and life goals and values.
So it seems to be from all 3 of you that this pandemic has allowed the families to come together and work on issues, projects that they hadn't been able to before. Is that fair?
Yes.
Let me ask you in turn, how have you in your firm, how have you had to adapt to these new client needs? And I'll start with Alex. How have you adapted the firm to serve the client?
So, the good news is we were working on building those capabilities and had made quite a bit of progress when it happened. So I think we were ready to take on those new needs. And we've engaged families more than ever, I think, on issues having to do with family well-being, asking them more questions and finding them actually very open to talk about it. And I think the lockdown has also prepared them for that. When you're stuck with your family for a while, you reflect on this family dynamic that you have, whether you like it or hate it. And it has led to really great discussions, deep discussions, and often a desire from our clients to start to work on some of those issues and identify things that they like and want to preserve and strengthen, and maybe also behaviors that they want to retire, their inability to deal with conflicts, for example, or to talk about some issues, and turning to us for advice, for coaching, asking us what other families we're doing, which is always a high curiosity of families we work with. We're trying to create that environment of making those discussions possible, of allowing our clients to realize that this is not a sign of failure that they're discussing these issues. It's par for the course for most families with wealth, and that there's help out there, that there are resources that can actually help address these issues with the same level of rigor and professionalism as you did with financial issues.
Interesting. And Steve, what about you? How have you guys adapted at PK?
Yes, similar to what Alex mentioned about Hawthorn, PKF O'Connor Davies had really put in place a number of new services over the last several years, and have been focusing on advice, and family advisory services is one area that has expanded the ability to really deal with many of the issues that the families are facing today, like family dynamics, education, governance, et cetera, as well as philanthropy, for example. On the family office and family business side, PKF has been serving private business owners for decades, and it's probably one of the most significant clients that they have. And they have obviously been reaching out to assist smaller businesses with all the information they need about CARES and PPP and tax law changes. But we also have, both on the business side and the family office side, the ability to help with outsourcing, which has become a definite interest and need of many businesses and family offices.
When you say outsourcing, elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, the outsourcing can be for any function they have. Obviously, we are an accounting firm, so we can be an outsourced CFO, so that financial management, bill pay piece can be easily outsourced to us. Tax, lifestyle management. Similar to what Melina said, we often do audits or best practice reviews for family offices, and during this period of time, that certainly has become more and more of interest to family offices, as an example.
Melina?
So I would say that the most interesting thing for me from the firm perspective is that the transition to working from home was almost seamless. I think that my business is very in-person dependent. You become very close with the families that you work with, and the pandemic has only brought the relationship closer, that the personal issues are very much at the forefront of their minds. And there's a lot of discussion about, how are you, looking at your life now that you're in the pandemic? And clients have said, we're assuming we've been in lockdown for 100 days and we expect to not be returning to our regular lives for at least another 100 days. And how do we want to spend those days? And that's where the outsourcing that Steve discusses comes in. I don't want to sit at my chair in my, COVID quarantine talking about the same issues over and over. And the importance of business issues has somewhat diminished in light of the pandemic. The other thing that I found that's interesting is there's a lot more cross collaboration at our firm. So groups that I wouldn't normally work with on a day-to-day basis have now been integrated, and vice versa, because of CARES Act issues, Main Street lending, PPP, EIDL loans, insurance issues. So groups that you don't normally work with on your day-to-day operations have now become relevant in the world for these families. And I find that very warming, that there's this group that comes together to serve clients no matter what their client needs are.
It's interesting. One question that you inspired, Steve and Melina, is that some wealth advisors have been concerned that because they're not face-to-face, that it may be challenging to conduct business development. Have you encountered situations where you've had to talk to prospects or onboarding new clients and you haven't been able to do it face-to-face? Or seen examples where, and what the effect is of not being face-to-face on your business development? And Alex, maybe you can share.
Yeah, we've had actually a situation where we acquired a new client without having an opportunity to meet with them face to face, which was a first, obviously, because it's atypical in our industry. But nonetheless, with technology, I mean, look at us today. We're connecting, we're seeing each other. There's a flexibility that comes with that. And we're seeing it with some of the family retreats that used to be done in person, obviously. And nobody would have thought of doing a family retreat virtually. But I just did one last week with a family that was scattered all over the country, and they found it very convenient. They were able to do in a day what would have taken 3 days, 1 day to get there, 1 day to have the retreat, and 1 day to fly back. It's not necessarily a substitute, but I think it's giving people access to a new range of possibilities. And I think you're going to see families when it comes to retreats, for example, saying maybe every other year we do it virtually, and every other year we meet face to face. So maybe we do 2 retreats a year, and the one at the halfway point, we do that virtually. So it's opened the minds, and I think we've achieved in 3 months what would have taken 3 years otherwise. There's definitely been an acceleration, and that also ties into the outsourcing that both Melina and Steve mentioned. Quite a few single family offices, I think, were reluctant to operate virtually, feeling that there were confidentiality issues, feeling that the family was so unique and everything they did was so customized that they all had to be under the same roof. And they've come to realize that they've actually worked really well in a remote environment. And suddenly it's opening their minds to the fact that their virtual ecosystem can actually include people who are very far from each other geographically, can include advisory firms and other experts that may not be full-time on the team, but would work really well and bring in the right expertise at the right time when the family needs it.
Interesting. Steve, what about you? Business development, how are you seeing that whole non-face-to-face virtual process go?
The sales cycle, obviously, in working with these clients is a long cycle. So I will say that most of the prospective clients that we're talking to, we have met. So the transition to video conferencing during this period of time has not affected anything. We've been able to close clients, and although we've been introduced relatively recently to a number of new potential clients, I would expect that the initial meetings, will continue to be by video conferencing, but we have started to get requests from clients to have face-to-face meetings, and I would expect that will start to occur potentially, as we move into July, and hopefully as some of the health issues, if you will, related issues and vaccines, et cetera, are put into the system.
So let me ask all 3 of you a related question. Do most of your clients come in through referrals? Alex?
Yeah, probably I would say half of our new business comes through referrals today.
And the other is you seek out through
Yeah,
business?
yeah, different channels, but referrals is the lion's share.
And Steve, for you, what percent?
Yes.
Majority?
Yeah, I would say the majority are referrals, but as Alex just mentioned, there are a number of industry groups and related institutes, councils, et cetera, where we do meet families directly.
And Melina, how about you?
I would also say referrals, but they're much more organic in the sense that they could be, because the law of private wealth is not a thing. It's really anything from tax to real estate to trust to CARES Act issues to insurance to regular business issues. There's a lot more crossover. So it's not as narrow to say you have to be a high net worth family in order to use either my services or the services of my firm. So there's been a lot of relationships that have nothing to do with private wealth that have turned into private wealth relationships, if that makes any sense. So someone can come with something as simple as, can you look at the insurance provision in my lease to see whether or not I'm covered for COVID? And that turns into a relationship on multiple other fronts, whether it's back office support, legal support, introductions to other parts of our firm. Once the relationship is established, it sort of goes anywhere in any direction that you need.
So you're all 3 highly respected, highly admired people, and I'm not exaggerating. You have built skills over the years. What skills would you say to a young aspiring wealth advisor, or even someone who is a veteran but would like to improve, what skills have you found have been the most important skills, Alex, and then everybody else, to building client relationships and to getting those referrals that are so valuable?
I would say, and it took me a while to get there, but courage, courage to have the tough conversations, courage to talk about the elephant in the room that everybody's avoiding, including other family members, including family office executives. Obviously, there's a way to do that, but what I've learned is when you actually find a way to engage the person in the family you're dealing with or trying to build a relationship with on the real issues that matter, that nobody has the courage to bring up, you build a relationship that suddenly becomes at a much higher level, and there's great appreciation that comes from that person for having the courage to actually bring it up and put it on the table and provide support, obviously, to try to address it.
Can you share a story around that, or a topic that you've had the courage to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, one that comes to mind has to do with the age of the patriarch and the fact that when you get to a certain age, the inevitable is going to happen, and there will be a world without you at some point. And it's obviously the toughest discussion to have for some people, and the thought that not only they're not going to be around, but there could be all sorts of issues with the family after that time, with the wealth, and it can easily be overwhelming and create a temptation to not want to deal with it. But I think somebody needs to have that discussion and say, okay, let's, and scenario planning or projecting yourself, what would happen if you don't wake up tomorrow? And let's talk about what would the world look like? What would you expect your kids to do? What would you expect your spouse to do? What would you want to see happen? What would you want to avoid? And, as you start to go into the discussion, suddenly you realize that there's actually a lot of things that should be thought through, and that, you as the patriarch, you're clearly not indifferent in terms of outcomes, and you still have a chance to influence them now. So let's talk about it.
Interesting. That must take a great deal of relationship building and intimacy to talk
Yeah,
about.
it feels very risky whenever you're doing it, but I think there's a greater risk at actually avoiding the conversation.
Interesting. And Steve, you're a veteran, and one of the most respected people I know in the wealth management industry. So how have you built up those skills, and what would be an example of relationship building scenario?
Well, the skills in family dynamics, emotional intelligence are, I think, a priority in terms of any advisor to families of wealth. And the ability to integrate your understanding of the interpersonal issues of a family with the financial questions and issues they have in order to then deliver the right advice and hopefully help them develop the right plans for the future is absolutely critical. So, I mean, during this particular period of time, as family businesses or family offices were struggling, whether it was with remote work environments or the lack of business continuity plans. And then on top of that, they had issues relating to decision-making, which was because of these inadequate governance structures that they put in place. Being able to understand the different players in the family, why they're reacting in certain ways, and helping them to see what the actual objective, is of the exercise, I think is actually the most meaningful part of what, we do with families. But then being able to then integrate all of the various components to help them make the right decisions.
Thank you. And Melina, I know you've told me some stories over the years without ever naming names. You've been on other panels with me. So share with us, how does that relationship building work for you? What are the skills you've developed? And tell us maybe a story or two about that.
So I would say that my idea is the flip side of Alexandra's, which is that it's a trust relationship. So to Steve's point, the life cycle for these relationships tends to be very long, and the relationship of trust has to be built up over time. But once you've built it up, with one particular family or multiple families, it starts to spread, I guess I would say. So not only are they trusting you, but they're trusting you that if there's something you don't know or something you need to find out, that you're going to use someone that you trust. So it's sort of a passing down of the trust relationship. Obviously, the skill set has to be there, but that's part of your job as the trusted advisor to make sure that either you have the skill set or whoever you're asking for assistance for the family has the desired skill set. But it all stems from trust. And that's how you can have those difficult relationships, you know, and conversations when you need to. And your job is to not really always be the yes person. And I've been in the unfortunate position many times with some of my clients who I hope are listening, where I don't say yes. It doesn't mean that I say no, but I don't just say yes, whatever you want is what you're going to do. But I push back a little bit and make the hard questions get answered before you just execute. And it creates that artificial pause that they need to sort of think about some of the things that Alexandre raised in terms of succession, in terms of one of my clients who I hope is listening, his expression was, what if I go under a bus tomorrow? And it's not just about what age you are, and it's not just about what plans you have in place, but sort of looking at it holistically. I had another client say to me, I have no trouble talking about my, death. I'm perfectly comfortable with it. I don't understand why we would need to have a big meeting. And I said, well, maybe you're comfortable, but how about your wife? How about your kids? Are they going to be comfortable sitting in a room, sort of contemplating your demise, which is not a pleasant thing. And the conversations are around how to make sure that things are in place so everything is smooth and it's not a panic, and in a time of crisis that you don't have to start digging through drawers to figure out what happens the next day.
Interesting. So I'll ask you guys a question, because what you inspired me to think is something that I heard from a lady we all know, who once said to me, Milton, it used to be 90% wealth management, asset management, and 10% family issues. Today, it's 70% family issues and 30% asset and portfolio management. Would you say that's a fair characterization, or where would you put the number, Alex?
So I think the goal, should be 50-50, right? I mean, I see this as building a house on a foundation, right? And you want, I think, a very strong pillar on the financial side of things and a very strong pillar on the family side. And you want, I think, equal time and attention. Today, I would say that for the most part, speaking for the industry, it's probably in reality 90% financial, 10% family. I think the aspiration is starting to grow, and you're seeing some families want to push that boundaries and get closer to the 50-50. But, there's still not that many firms, I think, that are willing and able to have those conversations. I do think that there's, on one hand, families who feel that dealing with these issues is opening a can of worms and they're not quite ready for it. They're afraid about what's going to come up. And I think there are quite a few advisory firms who still find that family dynamics issues to be too unique, too different, too soft, hard to scale, hard to bill for, and therefore tend to shy away from them. I'm quite convinced that, and I don't know how long it will take, but at some point, 5-10 years out, we will all look back and realize that this was a turning point, and that it was ludicrous to actually have wealth management, financial advice without the family advice that comes with that. And it will become mainstream, but it might take 10 years to get there.
Well, you feel that the pandemic specifically has been a tipping point?
I think it has accelerated, definitely. And I saw that with families we work with where, these are typical families who were scattered all over the country, who were busy chasing things, some more meaningful than others. Hard to give you time for a discussion, and very focused typically on, okay, we're going to talk about estate planning and taxes, and focusing on things that were urgent more so than important. And with the time that came back being in lockdown, sometimes with their family, I think they got a much greater appreciation for the role that families plays in their lives as a source of safety, of security, the place you go back to when something happens, where you can sort of, re-energize, a place of resilience, and ultimately a place that you can relaunch from. And a lot of the discussions I had with families on these issues were great. It's, wonderful that you appreciate it, but now tell me what you're planning to do to make sure that this never goes away, or that it's actually even stronger next time you need it. And that's where usually you get silence on the phone, because people say, well, yeah, you're right. I take it for granted. I always assume that the family will be there. I spend a lot of time managing my financial assets. I don't spend a lot of time managing my family capital.
Thank you, Alex. Steve, what do you think the split is, the right split?
Yeah, I think what Alex said is true. It's far more focused on financial advice today. I think that the enlightened families, have moved significantly toward the non-financial advice and the understanding that those advisory services are really what will sustain the wealth for multiple generations. But the reality is those non-financial advisory conversations, family dynamics related, family governance related, are uncomfortable. So people naturally avoid them or try to avoid them. I think business owning families are more open to expanding the business governance conversation, especially where they have family members in the business, whether it's one or more, to include the broader family and have those broader discussions with the broader family. But I think the trend is there. And I think financial service firms, to be honest with you, are often struggling to incorporate this non-financial advice into their offering.
Melina, thank you, Steve. Melina, what are your thoughts on this?
So I don't see it as a percentage split at all, and maybe because of the size of the families and the level of the relationship I had from being with them in-house and now at a firm, everything is filtered through the lens of family. There is no clear division between family issues and business issues and legal issues. Everything is as if you're wearing, the family glasses and looking at any decision through that lens. So uniquely in family wealth and private wealth, decisions are not based on just the bottom line. So you don't look at a decision and say, well, is that going to make me money or not make me money? It's always filtered through the lens of the family values or the family goals. So my experience has been very different, that no matter what the issue is, legal, financial, business, lifestyle, it all comes from a perspective of the family lens. I don't know if that's fortunate or unfortunate, but there's no pure, and at least in my experience, legal issue, because it feeds into the financial issue, that feeds into the family dynamic, that feeds into succession and lifestyle.
Interesting. Any examples? I know you have a ton, but what
I have a family that I worked with that had a very lucrative investment in a particular alternative investment, and the matriarch of the family decided to redeem the investment because of a distaste for the fund manager that she experienced either reading something or seeing him do something, and felt that she did not want to have her money invested there. And even though there was investment advice that would have said, well, you're going to hit a big cost for redeeming, you're not going to be able to participate in the next fund, which is one of the disadvantages of what you're doing. It didn't matter. That wasn't the reason that the money was being invested. There's a lot of ability to vote with your feet when it comes to issues that are important to you as a family.
Okay, let's talk about social responsibility on behalf of these families. So tell us, what are they thinking right now in terms of social responsibility? Look at the tumultuous time we live in. That's why we talked about it being turbulent and transitory. So Alex, what are these families thinking when they think about contributing to the world, being good citizens? What is it that they're thinking? What is it that they're doing?
So, getting back to my overall comment earlier about wanting to have an impact. So that's definitely there. And I think that they're also seeing public capital retreat in many ways. And we've seen families, for example, deploy private capital to re-energize downtown in some major cities, investing in real estate, investing in infrastructure to really help revitalize cities that otherwise are failing because of lack of public funds. What we're going through, though, most specifically, and I'm not even talking about the pandemic, but I'm talking about what's happened with social injustice. I think families also struggle with those issues, even though They want to do something about it. I think internally they're having a hard time having those discussions. I think the younger generation is pushing, is challenging the older generations, saying, how could you stay silent, and how could things get to be so bad? And part of what we were talking earlier about the dynamic in families and wanting to address those issues, but not always knowing how to do it, I think is part of the transition that we're going through. They often lack the forum where they can have those discussions. They often lack the language or the process or the way to deal with heated conflicts. And I think that's also an area where they need help. They need help fostering communication, building trust, respect, so they can address these issues and have more of an impact. And lastly, with respect to the coronavirus, we've seen families actually want to have an impact quickly. Some of them, there's a family I can think of that we work with who has a distillery business, and they actually redeployed some of the production facility to make hand cleansers for first responders. So that was, I think, a really good example of saying, okay, let's put our capital, industrial capital, our capabilities to work to have an impact.
Thank you. Steve, what do you see in terms of social responsibility and taking it on?
Some interesting things, to be quite honest with you, are surprising to me. Many of our families, are interested in strategic philanthropy and, have been looking for that greater social impact prior to the crisis. But I think the crisis is actually not forced, but they've become more reactive. So rather than continuing to thoughtfully plan in terms of where their contributions will be made, they're being much more reactive, and they are doing things locally if that makes them happy. And I heard one client say, I wrote a check to, XYZ firm focused on education or hunger or whatever it might be. And that was what he wanted to do. And that was absolutely fine. The other observation, which I think will have kind of long lasting impact, is I think families now are talking more because the next generation are bringing up a variety of issues relating to COVID, to social injustice, et cetera. So I think that that's going to have a very positive impact going forward for families and bringing the next gen into more and more discussions. And hopefully that's starting with values and then going, right through to their philanthropic plans and objectives.
And Melina, before I ask you to comment, so it seems to me, Alex and Steve, that the younger generations are pushing the issue, not
Yes.
the older, right?
Yeah.
But once the younger generations are leading in social equality issues and other issues that maybe were not as considered as important by the older generations. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's fair. They're pushing, they're challenging. I think there's a lot of anxiety from the younger generation and the parents. And we see parents who are very anxious and don't know how to prepare their children for what's ahead. And, when I look back at the college admission cheating scandal about a year ago, I think that was clearly a manifestation of that anxiety of parents, wanting to find a way to prepare their children and being willing to cross the line and do something illegal, but in this desire ultimately to deal with that level of anxiety that I think is only going to go and has gone up with what's happening with the pandemic, with social injustice, what's happening with global warming. There's a lot of anxiety and concerns, and not that much support, I think, going into families to talk about these issues, let alone address them.
Thank you. Melina, tell us a little bit about that. Social responsibility, confronting the issues.
So I think that there's always been this trend for impact investing, to invest socially consciously, to also train the next generation in how to invest where your values lie. And there was a lot of freedom on the part of families to let the next generation use a certain amount of capital to invest in these projects, but they've always been formalized, structured, documented legal projects. And I think that during COVID and then the rioting, there was a lot, to Steve's point, a lot of loosening of these formal structures, and people just wanted to act immediately instead of saying, oh, well, I care about the oceans, and so I'm looking for a project that's going to make, you know, ocean sustainability or remove plastics from the ocean. And what can we look at? And then we do some due diligence, and then we identify companies, and we have some meetings, and we draft documents. It's a very long process and very sort of thoughtful. I think during the pandemic and the riots, there was a lot of check writing and a lot of mobilization. And to Alexandre's point, a lot of anxiety in the families and a difference of views between one generation and the next that would make for explosive dinner conversations and family members saying, I'm out, even though dessert isn't served. You know, I can't handle this inability to communicate. I think that that's also been an issue in the sense that everyone has views and they are able to express them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a communication and a finding of common ground between one person's point of view and another. And I don't think that's unique to wealthy families. I think it's just the way communication has developed in our current time.
So now let me flip it back to the industry. You are senior statespeople of the industry. What changes, improvements, enhancements need to take place in the wealth management industry to be more effective and to be more inclusive? I remember I was a young Hispanic kid and I always wanted to be a wealth advisor. I was waved off and told that that probably wasn't for me. And I think it was well-intentioned advice, but it had a little taint of, yeah, that's not for you. And I was discouraged at the time from doing it. So what is it that we need to do, Alex, to make this industry more attractive to multiracial, multi-ethnic, you know, all of the groups that need to be included in this industry?
So I think, first of all, that it's an opportunity. I think, you know, diversity makes teams stronger, smarter, more responsive. So it's not doing it because it's the right thing to do, but it's also self-serving. I think these organizations are going to be more sustainable and are going to do better over the long term. So there's something in it for the shareholders, if you want to think about it that way. And I would say that there are actually many opportunities to have an impact. I mean, think of the firms that we represent. It's the clients that we serve and working with a more diverse client base. It's the employees that we bring on board and building our teams. It's the role that also organizations play in our communities. I mean, most of the firms that we represent, I think, also have some philanthropic activities, are, you know, contributors to their communities. So there's a lot of small changes, but as you know, small changes add up to a lot and can really move the needle. And, you know, I was going back to what I was saying earlier about the fact that some families have realized that private capital is often more powerful than public capital because it's often more abundant. It's often, you know, better managed. And I think there's a similar responsibility here for the corporate world that we represent on this panel to do their part and have an impact on the issues that we talked about.
Steve, I'll ask you the question a little more differently because you know so many luminaries in this industry. I know just from your role as the founder of the Ultra High Net Worth Institute that you can bring people together. Do you think that the elder and primarily statesmen of this industry are ready to embrace what the young people out in the streets of all races, colors, and incomes and financial conditions are asking for?
Emphatically, yes. Because I actually think that these thought leaders and luminaries, excluding myself, have focused on are the family dynamics issues, emotional intelligence, inclusion, and diversity. And even if you think about the discussions we've had this afternoon about the differences in families and family members, I think that that's where they have focused their time. So I think that inclusion is just part and parcel of what they have as a goal when dealing with families and helping them through any issue or any decision-making process.
Thank you. And Melina, you're one of the few women I know in the industry. I think one of the top professionals in this field, bar none. And I think
Thank you.
sincerely. Tell us a little bit about the journey and tell us about what the industry can do to attract people who and give opportunity to everyone who deserves it.
So I think the barrier to entry is low in the sense that this trust relationship and this emotional intelligence, to Steve's point, is something that is necessary, and it's not based on gender or race. If you have it and you are someone who is always looking out for your client, thinking about them during your day, even if it's not something that you're working on for them, they know it. It's not something that you can always have in a skill set or an education or a degree. It's a certain mindset and how you service your clients. And there is no barrier to that quality. I think that the skill set also, we've always had the opportunities to be educated and to learn. And I think that naturally, as our industry evolves with the families who are now focused on their other generations and the younger generations who are focused on social issues, it will all come together. I completely agree with Alexandre. I think there were days when, practices in this area were limited very regionally to either your particular state or even your particular country, and it's already expanded globally. We have families who are US families whose children live overseas, or overseas families whose children live in the US. So we've already had to expand our reach and our scope in terms of regular issues, whether it's tax, but now it's cross-border tax, or it's trust, and now it's cross-border trust, and looking at things more globally. And I think that's already part of the process in being more inclusive. And it's going to continue to be in demand by the families.
So one final question. Do you see great prospects for the wealth management industry? Will it continue to grow, Alex?
I think it will if for the firms that evolve, right? For the firms that are willing to tackle these issues having to do with human capital, and firms that are willing to not only prepare wealth for their families, but prepare their families for wealth. Those who do not go through that evolution, I think, will have a hard time and will find themselves to be perceived to be more and more of a commodity, will face more and more pressures on fees, and will ultimately be displaced by cheaper solutions, partly driven by technology and robo-advisors, where they won't be able to compete.
Thank you. Steve?
I think that advice is going to be the focus. And as Alex said, I think financial service firms specifically are going to have to transform the way in which they're doing business today. They've struggled with the ultra high net worth, and they've struggled with serving family offices for decades. They provide great products, sometimes great services, but it's this integrated advice that factors in the personal issues that the family is facing with the financial decisions that need to be made, that need to be delivered in an objective and independent way. And I believe that the industry can transform, and hopefully it can be done sooner rather than later. But I think families are recognizing the need for advice, and it's going to be those firms that are delivering that type of advice that I believe will own the relationship for the long term.
Thank you, Steve. Melina, you have the last word before we go to questions.
So I agree with both Alexandre and Steve. I think that there are services that are commodities, whether it's in the financial services, legal services, or otherwise. And the differentiator is going to have to be that level of integration with the family issues and the customer service, the experience that the client has.
Thank you. Thank you all for a very insightful 50 minutes. Now we're going to go to questions. And Katie, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Milton. Attendees, please send any questions that you have through the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to address as many as we can. The first question that we have, Milton, is with regard to families and their advisors. How are they handling the due diligence checks on investments effectively when they're obviously forced to work from home due to the pandemic? Even though the modern technology is improving, is this forcing families to delay decisions for significant periods of times, or what is happening there?
in terms of being able to conduct due diligence. So Alex, have you seen any drawbacks, delays, postponements of investment decisions because of the inability to conduct that physical due diligence?
No, I don't have a specific example that comes to mind. I think that most organizations have adapted quite well to virtual remote work. So that hasn't come up for us.
Steve?
Well, I think the operational due diligence, relating to investments has slightly slowed things down, but similar to how we've all adapted to the remote work environment and video conferencing, I believe that, the due diligence is being done, but I don't think, they're able to kick the tires as they used to. So I think it's a little more difficult, but hopefully that'll change as we move forward in July and August.
Thank you, Steve. Melina?
I would agree that there may be a slowing, but what I've seen is also a shifting. So if there are projects that require more in-person, hands-on due diligence, it just gets moved to a back burner, and a back burner project gets moved to the front burner. But anything that needs to get done is getting done. And we even have clients that are starting family offices during the pandemic. So clients who've hired their CFO without ever meeting them in person.
Mm-hmm.
Skype has been the entire relationship, or over WebEx, and they hired them and they're working and doing their jobs. So that if there's something that needs to get done and it's important, there's been zero problem. And I think that it's actually been conversely more efficient, in the sense that if you cut out all of the things that are unnecessary, which I think a lot of people have learned, there's a lot of things that are unnecessary, you can sort of get what you need done right away.
Interesting. Yes, that's the paradox of life. And then the next question, Katie?
So this ties back very much so to what we were talking about previously, with the younger generations really taking a stand and speaking up more in conversations. But the question is, have you noticed new voices becoming louder at the table, and people in the family that have showed, let's say, more strength than usual? Based on those conversations, what are the top 5 worries right now?
So Alex, why don't you handle that? What are the top 5 worries of families, or maybe as many as you can list right now?
So I do agree that there's a tipping point, I think, in conversations within families between the younger generation and the current one, or the older one, depending on how you want to look at it, that has been brewing for a while. I mean, global warming has been a topic where the younger generation is turning to the older generation saying, look at the world that you're leaving for us. I think the pandemic was part of that, the globalization, and the now social injustice. And it's gotten to the point where we're seeing clients who feel a bit uneasy about how do you have that conversation, and how can we discuss it with the next generation? What are other families doing? And we actually want to do some programming on that topic to really help other families come up with the fact that, look, nobody's doing it perfectly. It's better to talk about it than to avoid it. That we know for sure, and maybe try to facilitate and coach some of these conversations. In terms of the worries, I think the worries of families, have remained the same. The only challenge is there's more change going on. So I think those worries are becoming exasperated. But it has a lot to do with worrying that the family will not be able to stay together, worrying that the children will be entitled by the wealth, worrying that some of the values that have led this family to succeed will not be there into the future. And those are big issues for which there's no real easy answer. What we tell families is hoping for the best, and keeping your fingers crossed is not enough. And having a discussion, gathering the family to talk about what do we stand for as a family, what type of legacy do we want to have, what's our vision for our family together, are ways to start making progress on these topics. And I remind families often that finding the answer to those questions matters, of course, but the process itself is probably as valuable as the outcome. And getting together, sending the message to the next generation that we're going to talk about those issues together, that they may not have a vote on everything, but they have a voice, I think sends a very strong message that in itself changes the dynamic in families, and I think takes them to a level of constructive discussions rather than criticism. And that's a big step forward.
Thank you. Very, very well articulated. Steve, what are the biggest worries of families right now?
PKF O'Connor Davies has recently put in place, and actually it was before the pandemic, family gatherings. And it was launched globally out of our London office. And we've pulled together, if you will, say 15 families from around the globe. And it started over a dinner, but actually as we moved into the pandemic, it's moved into virtual family gatherings. And we've been able to talk with families and those with family businesses, family offices, and leadership has been a huge issue going through this pandemic. And as we talk about kind of the next generation, I think they have the ability to now step up regardless of where they're sitting geographically. But I think during the initial part of the crisis, many families found that not just the next generation, but the senior members of the family do not possess the right leadership skills. They don't have the knowledge that they need, whether it's the business acumen or whether it is the ability to lead the family and communicate in the right way to bring the family closer together. So I think that's one of the bigger issues that has come out. I mean, other issues that came out related to the actual concerns around the business, the kind of initial period and cash management issues that they're facing. What will the business look like, depending on the industry they're in? So really transforming their business during this period of time to adapt to the new world is a huge issue, I think, for many families.
Thank you, Melina. We have a minute left. I really am going to give you the final word this time, and I'm very grateful to all of you. But Melina, what's the biggest worry?
I will make them concise. So I think that the voices have become louder because there's action. We have third generation or second generation family members marching, protesting. They're not just saying, this is my opinion, see you next time. They're actually using their actions to demonstrate to their families what their views are. I think that the relationship piece is very big. Do I want to spend my day running my business, or do I want to see my grandchildren more or less if you were stuck with them during the pandemic? That's just a joke. So I think the family relationships really matter. I think wealth preservation is always an issue because G1 works very hard to create the wealth. And so we want to make sure that we have structures, legal and otherwise, to protect it, preserve it, and grow it for the next generation. And I think lifestyle issues. Right? People who are living in the city are saying, well, that's not really where I want to live. And I want to be at my, second home or at the beach, or I think that's going to be a huge issue. And I think all of that ripples through whether they're an embedded family office, a virtual family office, or a single family office.
Thank you. All of you have been so generous with your expertise. You're wonderful people. And I want to thank you. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today. God bless.
Thank you.
Thanks, Milton.
Thank you, Steve.